few grants over the last 10 years during my early career period myself. So I've definitely picked up quite a lot of insights along the way, and I thought that I would have something hopefully valuable to share, and I hope you all get something out of it. So I'll just first give you an overview of the structure of what I'm going to do today. I'm going to first introduce you to myself and a bit about my grant writing history, just so you can see where I'm coming from with giving you this advice. We'll discuss the obvious of why would you actually write grants. This is something that a lot of PhD students and postdocs don't quite understand, especially if they have funding already. How to identify grants, so how you should actually know what type of grants you should be going for and how to find the information that you need. Then the important part of writing a successful grant. Balancing time commitments, which is the big question. How do we actually find time to do this and our other work? And making the most of a rejection, because realistically, when you get into grant writing, you do start to quickly realize that rejections are more common events than actually getting the grant accepted. So rather than being disheartened, we'll talk a bit about how to turn this into a positive. So first I'm going to describe myself. Who am I? Who is this person and why is she telling me to apply for grants? So most of you have probably never heard of me. I am a research assistant professor at Trinity College Dublin, and that's in the School of Psychology and joint with the Institute of Neuroscience. So being a research assistant professor means that I have my own small lab group, and this is quite a recent position. I just started this in October, and I set up my own new lab with a grant. So I'm entirely funded externally by the Health Research Board on an Emerging Investigator Award. You might also know me because I was the winner of the Brainbox Research Challenge in 2018, and that was a fantastic opportunity that I would encourage everybody to go for. So at the moment, the grant that I currently have gives me 4 years to establish my new lab. It covers all my research costs, my PhD student, research assistants, everything that we would need. I do still consider myself as an early career scientist at this point. This time last year, I was still a postdoc. So I'm going to give you today the type of overview that I would have liked to have had during my time as a PhD student and a postdoc. And also during that time, I attended many grant talks from some of the big funding agencies and picked up quite a few tips along the way there. So what I'm going to give you is, real good, honest advice from an early career scientist to other early career scientists. I should first describe a little bit about my field of research, knowing that most of you or many of you may not be in the same field. The advice I will give here is general, but ultimately your field will impact the type of grants that are available to you, and even the expectations of reviewers and in terms of publications and that sort of thing. There are slightly different expectations across different fields. So I'm in neuroscience. I'm mostly working within the realm of sensory and motor systems. I do brain stimulation, hence the association with Brainbox. I also do some, and actually on that note, next Monday I'm doing the webinar again, and it will be on brain-computer interface next Monday at 2 o'clock. So please come back for that one. So I'm going to talk you through my own grant writing journey over the last 10 years during my PhD and my postdoc. But first, why should you actually write a grant? So I have everything I'm going to describe here are traps that I have fallen into at different points in my career. So one thing is, why would you apply for a grant when you already have funding? Maybe you have a nice, comfortable position, nobody's putting pressure on you to apply for grants, and you have lots of work to do. Why would you want to take the time away from getting your publications out, doing everything else you're working on, doing your research to write a grant? But realistically, no matter what career stage you're at, grant writing is an integral and very important part of your academic life. By grants, I should first explain what I mean. So I mean anything where you write an application for money or resources to support your planned research. So that could be a scholarship to support your PhD, for your tuition fees, for your stipend or your salary, your research costs. It could be a postdoctoral research fellowship to support your salary and your research after your PhD. It could be a small grant, so a travel grant to attend a conference or to go to another university to study or to collect additional data. It could be a small grant to buy a piece of equipment or a bigger grant. It could be a large PI grant. You know, maybe you're at the same career stage I'm at where you're thinking about first big PI grants where you're trying to fund, you know, enough money to actually hire a postdoc or something like that. So grants come in all shapes and sizes. Under this same heading, and you know, equally covered by all the advice I'm giving today, is awards. And awards also come in various forms. That could be poster prizes, young investigator awards, and in particular the Brainbox Awards. So look at the Brainbox Early Career Award and even the Research Challenge. So while it may not be considered traditionally a grant, exactly the same applies. You know, all the same tips apply. So obviously there's going to be additional pressure on you to think about to write a grant. So it's important to think about whether you really want to do this and whether it aligns with your future goals. So if you're planning to stay in academia, obviously writing a grant makes a lot of sense. But if you're planning to finish your PhD and open a coffee shop, then maybe you don't want to put yourself under the additional pressure of writing a grant. So think about where you want this to take you. Of course, you will know that your publications are your academic currency. So they're essential for your progression as a scientist. And you've probably heard the phrase publish or perish. So if you want to progress in a research career, you need publications. But exactly the same applies to grants. You need to be able to show that you are bringing in funding to the lab and that you've got a track record of achievements in this regard alongside your other academic track record. So here the short game versus long game strategy also applies. And this is a way that I heard it explained before, and I think it really makes a lot of sense. So the short game strategy relates to aiming for smaller and more easily accomplished studies that could be rapidly published. So usually these would be kind of the safe options and perhaps not targeted to top tier high impact journals. The alternative then is the long game strategy, where you're aiming for larger, more complicated, high risk, high return studies. You're normally aiming to get these into top tier journals, but it's not normally possible to pursue long game exclusively. And realistically, a combination of both approaches will lead to a more successful career. So this strategy also applies to grants. So go for the smaller, low risk grants as well as the larger, high risk, high gain grants, and try to get the right balance, because remember that the small ones will breed the big ones. So funding breeds more funding, and you should try your best to scoop up like kind of smaller local grants where possible, and that will make you much more competitive when you then start to go for the bigger grants. So in terms of my own grant writing journey, I'm not going to hijack the whole talk by telling you all about me in the last 10 years, but I think it makes sense to describe, you know, some people may not know what someone else's journey looks like. So how many grants have I applied for? What does it look like? How many successes? How many failures? What have I learned along the way? So I'm just going to describe to you what I've done. So in the box here, poster prize. This was just at a conference. I think everyone was entered into this, and that was a very small travel grant of £250 towards traveling for research related activities. And of course that was great because that was early evidence of getting a grant, which then helped for the next grant application, which was in 2012. I got a Guarantors of Brain conference attendance grant, and that was to go to Society for Neuroscience in the United States. Then the following year, I applied for the British Psychological Society Travel Study Grant. The purpose of that one was because I wanted to go to Belgium to learn neuroimaging. So we were collaborating with a group who were then based in Belgium, and I really needed to learn from them. So I wrote this grant myself, and I seeked out the funds to go there and get that information, and it was one of the most valuable things I ever did in my career. And again, just showing evidence of grant writing early on in the process, because my PhD didn't come with money for traveling. Other PhDs will come with money for travel. So you might not feel the need to go for these sort of things, but if you have gone to the bother of writing a grant, then that's another line in your CV and evidence that you can do that. So then in the yellow, lots of yellow, is my 6 years as a postdoc and research fellow. The first grant I got there was a grant which I was a co-applicant on, so I did not write the grant, but I collaborated on the grant. My collaboration was in the form of putting in pilot data that I had worked on. So they were collecting the data, I was analysing the neuroimaging data, and that data then is what got them the big, or it wasn't a very big grant, but it got them the grant to do that study. So 2014 that was. Then there's a massive gap, as you can see. 2018 then, I got my Irish Research Council postdoctoral fellowship, and that covered me for 2 years to conduct a research study in Dublin. In the in-between period, I was in Switzerland for 3 years. So after that then, 2018 turned out to be quite a good year. I got a travel grant from Neuroscience Ireland to go to Germany to a conference. I then got a visiting scholarship from Utah State University. So this was something which was not an official grant per se, but it was something created by the university to bring me over to share knowledge. So we were working on a project together, and we knew that it would benefit for me to come over and develop some new EEG processing pipelines. So the PI over there actually teamed up with the dean of the university, and they created this scholarship to bring me over. I then won 2 awards in a row for Publication of the Year on it was Nature Communications paper in 2017. So again, these were collaborative awards. So these were applied for by my co-workers at the time. Then there was the Brainbox Research Challenge, of course, towards the end of 2018. And shortly after that then, I got the Neuroscience Ireland Early Career Investigator Award. And these are in sequence, like each one of these helped the next one to happen. So, you know, for example, by getting the Brainbox Research Challenge, that really gave me something to write when I applied then for the Early Career Award from Neuroscience Ireland. Then in 2019, I got a childcare grant from the British Neuroscience Association. I think a lot of people overlook these kind of grants. Of course, this is relevant only if you have a child that needs caring for at a conference. And I got this because I was attending this conference to give a talk. And these grants are to allow you to basically bring your kids with you if you need to. So my baby was only a few months old, so this allowed me to bring somebody with me to look after the baby at the conference. It just shows evidence of grant writing, sustained grant writing. And then at the end of 2019 was the big one. This was the Emerging Investigator Award, 711,000, which allowed me to set up my lab and which funds us entirely for 4 years. So now then the blue is in my new position as a research assistant professor. The first, well, I wouldn't even say it was a grant, but this was an award, which was an early career award from the Psychological Society of Ireland. And that one was for a poster presentation, so it wasn't quite a grant, so to speak. The next one was a grant that I wrote to bring over a visiting professor. Most universities will offer these kind of things, and it's very good to go for this. You know, you're obviously showing evidence of international collaboration and also evidence of grant writing. Embark Fund, which is an industrial grant, so it's a grant to work with industry. So another thing you might need to think about is, you know, can you expand your grant writing beyond just core academic focuses to more commercial focuses? Can your research be useful in an industrial context? So this all paints a great picture, and you might think, God, I've been so successful, but don't think about it like that, because the next slide shows you all the failures along the way. And there were a lot of failures. So my very first ever attempt at grant application was a failure. It was for a Wellcome Trust PhD scholarship, and this would have involved a year in the USA. And I got as far as interview, and I got onto the reserve list, and then didn't get it. So then, as you can see, it was actually a useful exercise to put them all in order, because it let me see that the grant writing actually had a very noticeable dry period. And that dry period was during my first postdoc, where I just had failure after failure after failure after failure. And looking at it helped me realize, what were the problems along the way, and hopefully that has given me some insights that I can share with you, because I can see now that at the time I was sending in these applications, my CV just wasn't there for it. So I just didn't have the publication track record to allow me to apply for those types of grants at that time. So I will talk later about how important it is to make sure that your eligibility is very, very strong. Okay, sorry. So another thing I noticed when I put together all of those was the importance of collaboration. So maybe it's a bit of a no-brainer, but collaborate as much as you can. Be generous with your time and your skills, and it will come back to you at some point. So collaborations can be a bit of a slow burner, where you maybe get involved in something that can take years to produce anything. But normally it turns out to be more benefit than detrimental. Of course, I would advise assessing the situation with every collaboration. So check out whether the group that you're going to collaborate with have a good track record. I would not recommend collaborating and investing a lot of your time to help someone who does not have good productivity or who cannot do their part of the collaborative project. But if you are invited to collaborate with someone who you think that this could really benefit you and benefit them, and sharing skills, this is always a positive thing. It also allows you to travel. So travel where you possibly can and build up a strong international network. Many grants will actually focus on international collaborations. And another note in collaboration is to keep an eye on other disciplines beyond just your own immediate discipline. So there are often opportunities for interdisciplinary projects, and some grants actually require interdisciplinary cooperation. So it's really good to have colleagues in other fields, in other kind of peripherally related fields. And it also just breeds ideas. So if you can have interesting discussions with people and keep abreast of what's happening in other fields, it gives you ideas for collaboration. And when you look at my grant journey, if you were to take out the collaborations, it all looks a bit more scant. So collaborate. This is extremely good advice. So then on to the next section, which is how to identify grants. How do you know what's available to you and whether you should be applying for it? It's important to be informed. And the only way to do this is to reach out. So if you're serious about applying for a grant, whether that be a fellowship or a grant to move from postdoc on to the next level, it would be advisable to make contact early with your department's grant officer. And all universities should have a research office, and the research office, their job is to manage, but beyond that, your sub-department may even have a dedicated grant officer as well. This grant officer may already have a list of potential opportunities available to you, but if they don't, you can also compile your own list. You can take time either on your own or with your colleagues to Google search all the possible funding agencies and make a list of all the grants, the fellowships, the award opportunities, and if possible, dates associated with them, so that you can give yourself a timeline and a to-do list for the grants and the fellowships which are coming up next on your supervisor and your colleagues and your collaborators aware of your intentions. So if your supervisor knows that you're actively searching for a fellowship position, or that you're halfway through your postdoc and you've decided that it's time to move on and you're looking for a position somewhere else, make people aware of this, because then they can keep their eyes open for you and keep you in the loop if there are opportunities that are presented to them that they can then share with you. If your colleagues are aware of what you're doing, they can share advice, particularly more senior colleagues can help you with grant applications. Also collaborators, because it may be that an international collaborator is aware of a grant that is available in their country that is not available in your country, but that has a mobility aspect. So if your collaborators are aware, they can open you up to other grant opportunities that you would not have found locally. Another thing is to talk to your peers to get an idea of what's out there. So if you look around you in your department, everyone will be funded by something. So ask people, how are they funded? And that'll help you get an idea of what are the big funding agencies, where are people getting their funding from, and what would be your potential next opportunities. University web pages, they normally do list opportunities, and even within that, sometimes they will have mailing lists. So yes, so be on the appropriate mailing lists from your university, from the funding bodies, and even on the Twitter feeds. So, you know, some of the local funding agencies and even the international funding agencies will post opportunities as they come up on Twitter and on other social media outlets, of course. But if you're not on the mailing lists, then you're not aware of the opportunities. Or something I found was that sometimes I was on one mailing list but not on others, and I was finding out about an opportunity too late, with, you know, a month or 2 months to the deadline, which was no good. So being on the best mailing list, be, you know, on the mailing list for the source. If you're particularly looking out for a particular type of grant, make sure you are giving yourself every opportunity to be aware of it. Okay, so then checking your eligibility and your alignment with the goals of the scheme. This is really important. So if you have an eligibility query and you're thinking, I'm not sure, maybe it's a bit of a stretch, maybe I don't fit, you know, maybe there's a reason why I can't go for this. If you're really in doubt, there's normally an email contact for whatever scheme it is to actually ask them if you're eligible. But I would just say don't waste your time. So avoid wasting your valuable time if you're ineligible to apply for a grant or if your research is not a good fit. And again, this is something which I learned the hard way, because there were a few grants where I thought I was eligible, but I knew it was a bit of a stretch. And in my case, it came down at one point to nationality. And I was arguing that I was eligible, and I emailed them and convinced them that I was, and they said, okay, go ahead. But then the grant bounced back and said, I'm not sure if you really are. And I had to write them a letter explaining that Northern Ireland is a different country from the south of Ireland and that sort of thing. And they did allow me to proceed, but then in the end, I didn't get it. And some of the reviewers' comments did relate to mobility. So, you know, if they want to see large international mobility, moving between adjacent countries might just not cut it. So that was a waste of my time. I shouldn't apply for that one. Or if your research is not a good fit. So grant bodies will often have priority areas in particular periods of time. So if you read, you know, if you're looking at the Wellcome Trust, read what is their remit at the moment. You know, what are they most interested in solving at the moment, and make sure that your research fits that. And if you don't fit, or if you're kind of stretching to fit or make it fit, then that doesn't bode well. So yeah, really just check out whether you're going for the right thing. Okay, so now on to actually writing the grant and introducing something called the first page effect. This is a real thing. So it's something I heard about at a grant talk, where someone who had been on multiple review panels was saying that the first page effect is real. That if you look back at 100 grants that you've just read and reviewed, you had a very strong feeling on the first page whether this was going to be one that gets on to the next stage or not. You have to knock them out. You have to absolutely communicate your idea clearly and well, and make it so clear that you're reading on the page. And at this same talk, the guy who was explaining this said that he once heard a reviewer in a group say, "This one had me at hello." So if you just knock them down, and of course knock them down in a good way, don't knock them down in a bad way. So if they immediately see the first page and there's something glaringly terrible about it, that'll also sink it very early on. So I'd say at the very end, go back and look at your first page. Think, this is the first thing they're going to see. Is this going to impress them? Something to really avoid is like building up these big long stories that lead to the climax, which explains how exciting your research is. But the problem is the person has to stay with you all the way through that. And that just might not happen, especially if it is very heavy and they need to understand a lot of detail, and they need to understand A, B, C, D, and E before they would actually get why the rest is important. So you have to try to explain early maybe that'll be in the abstract. They might ask you for a lay abstract, which is an abstract written in layman's terms. You should be able to explain that to the person sitting beside you on the bus. You know, of course, at the moment, nobody's sitting beside you on the bus, but you should be able to explain it to your grandmother. It should be possible. And if you're having a problem explaining your science at that level, you need to go back and rethink it, because it should always be possible to explain what is the point of what you're doing in an accessible way. And yes, you're probably going to be talking to other scientists. You're explaining it to other scientists in your grant, but they will not always be scientists in your immediate field. So on a bit to the assessment process. So this is a pipeline that I got from a research talk from one of the big UK funding agencies. It really helps to be aware of the scoring and assessment strategies that the funding agencies are using. Because if you know what they're doing, then you know how to avoid getting screened out at different points in that process. So put yourself in the shoes of the reviewer. In the beginning, that's kind of easier said than done. But for me, something I found was really, really useful was reading other people's grants. Ask your supervisor, can they share some grants with you? You need to see what a grant looks like, and you can read a successful grant and think, okay, this is why this was successful. But if you're reading a failed grant, pay attention to the feedback. That could also be equally valuable to you. And something really, really important, if you ever get a chance to, is to be a reviewer on a grant. So I did this as a postdoc and found it immensely valuable. It took me such a long time. I had to study the grant. I had to break it down into sections. I had to try to develop critical thought on what I was reading in a topic area that was not exactly my own field. You know, I had the skills to read it, but I was kind of still stretching a bit. But it was so useful to see, you know, the way they explain things, you know, things that I found were well explained, things that I found were not well explained. So it would be really good if you can get an opportunity to be a reviewer on a grant. Of course, being a reviewer on a paper already helps to build up your critical skills, but if you can review a grant, even better. So how does a postdoc or a PhD student get asked to review a grant? Good question. So one way, of course, is if you actually have publications in the field and they are aware of you and they think, okay, this is a person who has a track record in this field, let's ask them to review the grant. But more likely would be if you make your professor aware, so make your supervisor aware that you would like to review grants and review papers. Chances are they're being sent things all the time, and occasionally they might just not have time to review it, and they might be able to suggest you as an alternative. So it's quite a common thing that can be done. It comes back to what I said before about making your supervisor aware of your intentions, because then they can also put you on the radar for things like this, things that would be really useful for you if they have a lot on their plate. Things that would be really beneficial for you, but that they just can't find time to do, like reviewing a grant. So yeah, you could be they're kind of second in line for when they don't have time. And it's a great learning opportunity. So there are two kind of triage stages in this particular assessment process. The first is a preliminary application. And by the way, not all grant assessment procedures will be exactly like this. This is kind of the grant that I went for did have this preliminary application stage where you put in, it was still quite a hefty grant application in the beginning. And say if they get 500, they will screen that down to 50 in the very first step at the preliminary application. And that's good because it also saves you a lot of time and effort if you're not going on to the main application stage. The main application then is a much bigger submission. So in my case, this was a 100-page document in the end. They don't want to review 500 of those. They want to review 50 of those that have passed the pre-screening. So then you might move on to another expert review stage where there will be another triage. And particularly at this stage, here's where your first page effect comes in, and maybe also in the preliminary application stage, where a specialist will be reading it and reviewing it. They will decide whether to pass it on to an external expert peer reviewer. If you make it to that point, then the expert peer reviewer will give you detailed feedback on your grant and what's good about it, what's bad about it, everything else. They will then typically feed that report onto the interview panel. And at the stage of the interview panel, it most likely then won't be people who are in your specific research area. It can be people with broad scientific experience. So you're at the same time, you're writing to try to convince someone who's in your own research field, but then you're also trying to pitch it at a level where you're explaining it to a general scientific audience. People who might have a good background in a lot of things, but maybe they don't know your specific research technique, or maybe they don't know the background of the research that you're describing. So it's about getting it right. Something that the grant funding agencies will focus on is the 3 Ps, and that is the person, the program, and the place. So, of course, the person is you and your track record. The program is the research that you have proposed to do with the money, and the place is where you're going to do it. The resources and the people that you're going to work with actually are also included in the place. So going through each of those in turn then, the person. So different grants, whether that be for a PhD scholarship or a fellowship or an early career grant, like what I did, they will be weighting these differently. So for fellowships, they tend to weight the person quite, it tends to take up quite a percentage of your final score, because they know that at this point, you are at an early stage in your career, and you're maybe writing this, maybe you're writing it by yourself, or maybe you are writing it together with a supervisor, but they are kind of looking at you rather than looking at the science that you propose to do. So it is important to present a competitive CV. As I said before, this is a mistake I've made at certain points, going for fellowships where my CV was just not up to scratch at that point. So the reality here is that even if you put in a massive amount of effort into your research proposal and you present the best, most airtight research proposal, if your CV and your track record doesn't cut it, the grant won't be successful, because they're allocating percentages. You could have 100% on the program aspect of it, but if you're scoring low in the other areas, then what was the point? So something which is good to do is contextualize your publications. So by that I mean help the person reading it get an idea for how good is this publication. So what did you do, or not necessarily how good it is, but what was your contribution to this publication? So if you are a middle author on a paper with 10 authors, you might want to just add a little line after the reference stating what you actually did. Also, many grants will actually ask for this, but even if they don't, it's a good idea to give them some journal rankings. So someone reading your grant application might not be in your field, and they might not know about this journal. So they might not know that Neuroimage is a quantile 1 journal, that it has a very high ranking. They might have never heard it before. Journal rankings can be found online on Scopus or Web of Science, and it's a good way to figure out, the prestige of the journal in your particular area of research. So you can list, so whenever you're contextualizing your publication, you would have the citation, so with the usual things you would put in a citation, and then the impact factor, the quantile of the journal. Normally that section doesn't have a word limit, so you might as well put that in. It's your chance to actually give them the extra information and let them know what you actually did. Another thing that is very important when you're explaining yourself in a grant application is to clearly map out your vision for the future and your future career and your future research. So they want to fund future leaders. They're not interested in funding somebody who just wants to do this as a job to bridge a gap for a few years, and then they're going to go off and open a coffee shop. They want to know that what they're funding is part of something that's going to be something bigger. So they will always comment on your vision. Do you express your vision for the future? Do you know where you're going? And do you know where this fits into that? So, and that could be career-wise. You could say, you know, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, in terms of where you're going to go in your career. You know, if it's going to be an academic career, if you're going to go into industry, whatever that may be. But also in terms of research, that this particular research is going to inform this field of research, which will ultimately take me to, you know, a bigger research question that wouldn't be possible without the current grant application. Okay, so yes, have clear goals and be able to outline your clear goals. Then the last thing is reference letters. So these have to be absolutely glowing. And many applications, whenever you read, you know, their assessment criteria, they will actually say that your reference letter has to be absolutely excellent. It needs to be flawless. So I would say think carefully about who you choose to write your reference letters. Make sure that they're not going to write kind of just a weak recommendation of you. It needs to be a good recommendation. And also give them plenty of notice. Nobody likes to be surprised with the request to write a reference with a week's notice or a few days' notice. For anyone, and I've been on the receiving end of this as well, so writing a good reference letter takes effort and time on the part of the referee. It really does. You don't write a reference letter in less than an hour normally. You know, I really put a lot of effort into a reference letter if I'm writing it for one of my students. And it's not nice to receive an email saying, I need a reference letter with, you know, for next week. So give your referees a really good heads up. Also chat to them about what you're planning to do. Tell them about, you know, about the grant application, and ensure that they know what they're talking about, because if they say something wrong as well, that is inconsistent with what you've put in your grant application, that's also kind of a glaring fault there. So you are being evaluated quite heavily on your reference letters. So then the second P, which is the program. So possibly the most important part. It's really important to give yourself enough time to write this. So I have heard consistently throughout my career, attending funding talks and from personal experience, that very few last-minute applications are successful. So you should aim to have a full draft 1 month before the external deadline. Many universities will have internal deadlines as well. So that is where the research office will take your application and go over it. And they are really in a very good position to give you feedback because they have seen so many of these. They are reading yours in context with all of your peers. And they really want you to get the funding because it's their job to make sure that the university gets a lot of external funding. So make use of that and don't miss the internal deadlines. If they don't explicitly say they will do that, you can ask them to read your grant application, and most cases they will be able to do that. Be open to criticism very early in the planning stages and seek out opinions. So especially if you are working on this on your own, or without really good solid help from an advisor. If you're putting together a proposal, don't write it absolutely perfectly in the final stage that you want to send it and then ask somebody for advice. Talk to somebody early and beat your ideas off them. Make sure that your aims are legitimate, and make sure that your plan will actually work, and that there's nothing circular in it where your first aim absolutely has to work before your next aims can be done. Colleagues should be able to better to do this at the early brainstorming stages rather than later when you've become really wedded to a particular research pipeline. Then it's much more difficult to kind of change your plans, I think. So yeah, seeking out opinions from other colleagues is really, really important. The quality of your writing and attention to detail must be top standard. So this also seems like a bit of a no-brainer, but it is one of the most common things that will destroy a grant application. Again, something I heard in a funding talk was good writing will not save bad ideas, but bad writing can kill good ones. So nobody wants to read a grant application that is full of grammatical errors or just badly explained. It really needs to be perfect. So if you start early, you'll have time to pass it by enough colleagues to make it perfect. Obviously, you're submitting this and you're asking them to give you a substantial amount of money to be entrusted with to go and do a program of research. Often that is public money. It can be government money. And if you're showing poor attention to detail in your grant application, if your grant application is full of mistakes and you haven't had that properly checked, that does not bode well for you. So that gives an immediate bad impression of you as a person and your competency to do this. So just, don't sell yourself short over something that is so easily fixable. You could have brilliant science in there, but it won't shine through if you have a bad grammatical presentation of it. So then the next thing is feasibility of your proposed research. And this is also key and is also a very common criticism for people reading grant proposals. So it's quite rare that a grant will ask for something that is high risk, high gain. Some do, but the majority will want to see a very feasible plan that is executable within the financial and expertise constraints of your particular group, and of course the time constraints. So on the feasibility note, pilot data can often be your key to success here. If there are questions over feasibility, then you can rule out any doubts by showing that you have some pilot data, that you've already taken steps towards setting this up and collecting some data, showing that it's possible, maybe even showing, that there is some sign of the effect that you're hypothesizing. So pilot data where possible really does help. Another thing is demonstrating contingency plans. So you should always have contingency plans. Some grants have a dedicated section for this. So when I wrote the fellowship application, the 2-year IRC fellowship, they actually wanted me to explain what are the risks and how would I mitigate these risks. So it forced you to really think about, okay, what are you going to do if this doesn't work out, or if I just can't get enough people to make a statistical power and all of these kinds of things. So it forces you to think about it, but even if a grant doesn't ask you to, you probably should have a contingency plan in place that you can incorporate in to your research plan. Are your aims answerable by your method? And are your aims interdependent? So you should be explaining your aims very, very clearly. What do you want to achieve with your research? You should be spelling out the research question. You should be spelling out the hypotheses. And does your method, what you actually plan to do with your science, does it actually answer the questions that you're asking? Because this is also another common reason for grants to fail, is that they'll say, it's a great idea, I like the aims, but what you're actually planning to do doesn't really solve that. Maybe it contributes a little bit, but it doesn't actually answer that. Then also, are your aims interdependent? So the typical thing here would be work package 1 sets up a particular type of analysis, or it sets up a particular new technique. And then all the other aims are depending on the success of the first aim. So that's a risky thing to go into, especially if you don't have some pilot data. So watch out for those interdependent aims and make sure that that you've got contingency plans there if that happens to be the case. This is a real double-edged sword here, where they always want you to emphasize the novelty and the innovativeness of what you're doing while remaining feasible. So on the one hand, they're telling you it has to, on the other hand, they're telling you it has to be, you have to demonstrate that it's feasible. So this can be quite a difficult balance. There's no right or wrong answer to this. It'll be completely different depending on what area of research you happen to be operating in, but you just got to find the sweet spot. You got to find a way to explain things where it is innovative and novel, and also that you can achieve it. So you should be able to convince them that your track record is sufficient, that you have achieved things on this scale before and or using these techniques before. So even if you don't have specific pilot data for the research question you're asking, maybe you've used the exact same techniques before, so it should be possible to do this. You just have to find the best way to argue that to make sure that they take away the fact that it's novel, it's innovative, and they also believe that you can actually do it. So I have here a few quotes that I got from a research talk from one of the large UK funding agencies, and they basically quoted some real world reviewer comments. And reviewers can be so nasty. This is so true. Like, if you are a reviewer, please be nice to people, because people can be really, really harsh. And here are some particularly harsh comments, but very important for you guys to see now early, because then you won't make the same mistakes. So, here's a comment like, this project will lead to a number of high profile papers, but it will have no actual impact in the real world. And of course, you have to be able to argue that you will have impact and that your science really means something to the real world. Another one, they have come up with some brilliant but untestable hypotheses. That's definitely something to avoid. Here's some more. So the applicant says that this is completely novel, which is of course true if you ignore all of the previous work that has been done in this area. So if your grant lands on the desk of someone who is an expert in your field, which it should, that person will know if you're saying this is a novel approach when it actually isn't. So beware of that. Make sure that you are on top of the literature, just in general, reading every day, every week, making sure that you know what's going on in your research field should avoid this sort of thing happening. Being on mailing lists, most journals will send out tables of contents, which you should skim and have a look and see, is there anything in your field that is interesting, keeping you up to date with what's going on. The final P in the evaluation of your grant is the place. So normally the grants want to ensure that you're doing your research somewhere that can support you effectively. So they're going to look at the track record and the suitability of your supervisors. So maybe you're applying with, a young supervisor who has just started up a new lab, somebody like me. Maybe they look at the background of the person you're applying with and say, but they haven't been there for very, very long. Do they have enough publications in this field? Are you capable of, doing these particular projects together? You might need to show pilot data to argue around certain things. They will want to look at the infrastructure in your department. So it would be a no-brainer if you were going somewhere that just simply didn't have the machinery that you needed to do your project. Of course, that would be mitigated if you had budgeted for that piece of equipment in your grant application. So it is good to also point out if there are negatives, but then of course how you are getting around those negatives, how you're mitigating this. You will need to argue why the place is good for your research project and why this place is a good move for your career in general. So it needs to be part of your overall vision. Okay, so at this point, maybe I've lost some of you about 20 minutes ago where you're thinking, hang on a minute, that all sounds great, but where exactly am I supposed to find the time to write grants? So if you're an early career scientist, you will know that there just aren't enough hours in the day or days in the week to do the work that you want to do, or to do it to the extent that you want or as well as you want. So you don't need something else being loaded onto your plate as well as that. So getting the balance right is really, really difficult. This can be kind of further complicated by the fact that sometimes there's a bit of a conflict where, getting the balance between your current work commitments and your career advancement don't fit. So maybe your boss is paying you out of their grant 100%, and that is for you to work on a project, your publications are trying to, do everything that boss wants you to do. But you have to spend this massive chunk of your time on your own career advancement, writing a grant. Maybe that's a fellowship to move to a different university or whatever. So maybe it's not even in that supervisor's best interest. So as you can see from everything we talked about, grant writing is not just a breeze that will slot into your existing work. And I wish I could tell you otherwise, but many of the grants I've written were written in my own time, written in evenings, weekends, or while traveling. Maybe with better time management, I could have fitted that into my existing work schedule, but it is quite difficult because, especially if you are planning to go to a different lab or you're applying not with the supervisor they're currently working with or something like that. So you really should speak to your supervisor, and a good one will be supportive. So a good supervisor will understand. They may have even been in the position themselves where they will know that it's important for you to get grants, and that might not necessarily immediately benefit them, but that is just the nature of research, and that a good supervisor will allow you to use some of your work time doing that. If you don't have such a supervisor, you may want to speak to an external mentor. So normally universities have schemes where you can be mentored by somebody who is not in your own lab if you want. I think a lot of these schemes are very often underused, but can be very, very useful. So if you're not feeling like you have that support, or if there is a bit of a conflict of interest, then do seek out an external mentor. And that can just be a professor from another lab, perhaps, who is willing to be your external mentor, or it could be a postdoc, or somebody It could just be a friend who's in science, somebody to talk to who can help you with balancing your time commitment. But anyway, it's good for the supervisor that you're with at the moment to know what you're doing anyway. Another important thing is to give yourself dedicated time for reading, for planning future research, and for brainstorming for future grant applications. So sometimes if you identify this is going to be important for your future, you need to just protect that time in your schedule. Just block some time and make sure that you are getting the time to read widely, to think about your science, to really reflect on what you're doing, and is this the path you want to continue down? To come up with ideas, to get inspiration. And, you can't do that if you just don't have time. So setting yourself aside time is really important. If all else fails, you can take a writing retreat. So I've done this at times, even during conferences, just, knowing that I'd be away from home and away from the lab and away from, my current work schedule, just taking that change of scenery to write a grant. It's actually a good time to do it at a conference because you're surrounded by other scientists, and it's quite an inspirational place to be. Some people do also take a writing retreat where they just take a week off work and stay at home and write a grant. Yes, sometimes that might mean eating into your own holiday time, but I've definitely always found that finding the time to write a grant sometimes involves going the extra mile and eating into your own time. But anyway, grants are so important. They are an integral part of the cycle of research. So you're doing your research to generate publications, of course, and have an impact on the field. But then the publications are feeding into your grant writing because they are an essential part of actually getting the grant, because you have to be able to show that you have track record doing the research. And then you need the grants in order to get the research, or to get the resources to do the research. So it all feeds into each other, and in order for to have a sustainable lab, grant writing is a very important part that can't be ignored. So the final part that I want to talk about is how do you make the most out of a rejection, because as you've seen from my grant journey, and if you talk to other people, you will definitely also see rejection is more common than not. So you have to use it to your advantage rather than letting it get you down. And it is very tough being rejected from a funding application, especially if you've put your heart into it, especially if you've sacrificed your weekend for it. However, the feedback that you get is your most valuable asset. So who has no motivation and is also offending you, as you've seen, so use it. Use it to your advantage, and things work out best for those who make the best out of things, how things work out. So it would be a terrible shame not to use the feedback to help up your game the next time round. So, are you consistently hearing that your plan is too complex? Are you hearing that your plan is unfeasible? Is the problem with your CV rather than with the research? Then maybe it's time to stop applying for grants, focus on the CV, getting your research out and trying again later. Is the problem the location or a bad fit with collaborators? So maybe your research is great, maybe your CV is great, but you're just applying to go to a university just because you just want to be there. but they will see that. They will identify that that's not a good place to foster growth in your career or to see the research through. Your grant writing style will improve with experience, and really the only way to develop a good style is just exercising that muscle. So just writing grants, learning from experience, doing it again. But try to see the positives. So if you've written a grant and you've been rejected, at least you took the first steps. Some aspects of your next grant then will be copy and paste from the first time. So that's actually, it gives you a bit of a snowball effect where you're gaining momentum every time. Also in the process, you may have established some collaborative networks that might come back and benefit you in future, whether you got that grant or not. I definitely found that I learned something every single time. And I love this quote: "One's mind, once stretched by a new idea, never regains its original dimensions." And I really do love that, and I really think it applies to grant applications, because if I look at all those red boxes there for the grants that were my rejections, and at the time I thought that was such a waste of time, every single one of those stretched me, and my mind never returned to the original dimensions. You pick up with the next one at the point where you left off, and you have grown in the process. So just finishing on some action points for you. To ensure your grant writing success, why not start today and take the first steps towards identifying a grant or a scholarship or a fellowship that you want to target next. Get yourself on some grant email lists and Twitter feeds. You could today start sending emails to arrange meetings, to chat to colleagues, chat to your supervisor, chat to your university grant officer about your intentions. Or you could take 10 seconds to just block off time in your calendar for some future time, maybe next week, to start reading and brainstorming, so that you're just protecting your time to work on thinking about your grant. After that, when you've made your decisions, you should make yourself a set of time-locked goals to achieve parts of the application writing. So this is something I've always done, and I've always found that it was completely essential. So I would say, okay, the research proposal needs to be decided on by 2 weeks from now. And then I need to have the CV parts written with, for 4 weeks from now. And then, you have to time lock them. You have to make sure, because then you'll quickly see whether you're going to run out of time at the end, and you might need to go back and readjust your time goals. So I mentioned about ensuring that you protect enough of your future time in your schedule. So if you've decided that you're going to go for a grant, go through your schedule and block off big chunks where you're going to do each of the goals that you prepared. So if you're going to write the research proposal, set yourself aside, half a day every day for a week to make sure that you get time to do that. You might want to then give potential collaborators a heads up. So asking them if they would like to be involved, doing that very early in the process, or just ask them in advance if they'd be happy to read and comment on your application. So you want to get as many eyeballs on this as possible and as many opinions. So giving collaborators a heads up that it's coming is a good idea before you just send them the finished product. Also, giving your referees an early heads up is important for the reasons that I mentioned before. You're more likely to get a positive response out of them if they are not annoyed that you've just infringed on their time at short notice. So thank you so much for listening. It's a really weird experience talking to the computer, not seeing people and not getting visual feedback. So I don't know if you all tuned halfway through. Anybody has. And yeah, my email address is on there if anybody does want to contact me, and that's our lab website. So I think now I pass back over to Rory to see if there's any questions.
Yes, great. So thank you so much, Kathy, for turning your personal insights and giving up your time to help other people get something out of this. So we really appreciate it, and we're getting comments in the Q&A that the attendees do too. So a big thank you from all of us.
Thank you.
And we have got a couple of questions. Number one, can Kathy comment on how non-affiliated clinicians can obtain grant funding? outside of the university-based setting, but with university collaborators?
Yeah. You would need to check the eligibility requirements of the grant that you're going for. The one that I went for, of course, I was the lead applicant. So the lead applicant, there were requirements on that person that they had to be, at a university, or that they were actually allowed to also be a medical professional who was doing research as well. But then for the collaborators did not necessarily have to be affiliated with a university. So those were actually, that grant had co-applicants and then also collaborators. So there were different rules for co-applicants and collaborators, but the co-applicants, I think, even didn't have to be associated with a university. So you would have a problem being a lead applicant on a grant that said that you need to be at a university. But I don't think there's any problem with somebody who is a medical professional being a collaborator on a grant or even a co-applicant. They would all be different, but it would just be about identifying colleagues to work with and then searching out grants and checking the requirements before you go too far. Does that help at all, I wonder?
I think so, yeah, definitely. If there are any more questions that follow on from that one, we asked that they're put in a Q&A, but I'm sure it was fine. Okay. So the next question. Thanks for the great talk. Given the importance of demonstrating successful track records in funding applications, what would your opinion be on taking a fully funded postdoc position versus applying for a fellowship? And I think when they're on about fully funded postdoc position, it's one that's funded by a PI's grant. Yeah. Could it happen in the future if you take a postdoc job where you don't need to / aren't allowed to seek your own additional funding?
Okay, so actually, at one point I did that and it took a postdoc position where the funding was already secured. And that mentor was fantastic from the very beginning and knew that I was going into that applying for other funding because, he knew that I wanted to be able to show evidence of getting my own funding. Many supervisors won't mind that at all because, especially if it means that you're still going to be in their lab. So they've just gained you then, you've come in on their grant, you've transitioned onto your own grant, depending on whether the content of that is going to be the same or a totally different project. That would be the problem. But if you get your own funding halfway through a postdoc, that saves that supervisor their funding and they will be able to then use that for something else. And that's normally the case where they can actually, that funding doesn't get wasted. They can be quite happy with that because it means that they've still got you. You're just being paid externally. And that was the case for me, that we didn't really change so much what I was doing. I was still in the lab and of course I transitioned on to my own project at some point, but I was still working on what we had been working on together. So now if you're going in to work with a supervisor who says, you're going to work on my project that I've got funding for and I don't want you applying for other grants, that would be a very tough situation and you might need to think about whether it's worth going to apply with that supervisor if that's not somebody who's going to be supportive of your career. On a CV, it looks better to have got your own funding, hands down. If you're going to write that in your CV, it definitely shows you wrote it yourself. You have evidence of getting that funding. So I guess maybe that's the answer to the question. What's better? Yes, that is better. But you can take the other position and then transition to your own funding if your supervisor will allow that.
Sorry, it just went very quiet towards the end and I got scared about a disconnection. Thank you for taking the time to answer that. We've just got a few more. Can I ask Kathy, is she enjoying being a new PI?
Is that coming from my PhD student? Yes, I'm very much enjoying being a new PI. I love the flexibility of planning what we're going to do next, and I love choosing my team and working with people that I really enjoy working with, and I think we have a very happy work environment, and happy means productive. So yes, I am enjoying being a new PI.
Good. That's good to hear. Got two more. Thanks for the great information. How important is it to have a statistician as a consultant on the proposal? What about a collaborator or co-PI who has previously been funded?
I wonder, are those two separate questions? So in terms of having a statistician, I have never had a statistician on my grant. Other people I know have. So a grant that I've just been involved in the States, they have got a statistician on board. Some funding agencies will want to see that. My funding agency at the time, I didn't have a stats consultant. As far as I know, our university doesn't seem to have a service like that would be free to use for us anyway. There are some external services that we could pay to use for stats advice. They asked, would we allow a portion of our budget for stats advice from a stats consultant? That can be somebody that you pay, it could be a company that you pay to look at your stats plans and see whether they are sensible. But then that person isn't a collaborator in your grant. That's just it's just a service. So I have never done that. But if there had been such a person, I would have been very grateful for that, and I would have included them as a collaborator. I think it puts a lot of minds at rest if you can show that there is a stats expert on your grant or in your collaborative network. It certainly puts minds at rest. Some universities have a particular, they have a kind of, what would you call it, like a help desk room where you can go and talk to. So my previous university, we could email through to the math department, and they had a group of students who would be, it was like their part-time job to look at these statistical problems and give advice, which was good, because then we could say, okay, we've consulted with the statistics advice consultants in our university. So, okay, the short answer is it's not something I have officially done before. If it was available to me, I probably would do it, because yes, I think it really helps to show that you have taken advice, like good advice on your stats. There was a second part of that question.
Yes, it was, what about having a collaborator or co-PI who has previously been funded?
Who has previously been funded.
Yes.
So I don't know if that relates to the stats question, or if that relates
to two separate ones from the same person.
If they've previously been funded, it comes down to the rules of the grant. If the grant says that none of the co-applicants can already have had that grant, then you're not eligible. So, this comes back to what I said about reading the eligibility criteria really, really carefully, because if there's a clause in there that says that one of your co-applicants cannot have been previously funded in the scheme, then it stops there. But if that's one of those grey areas, you could email them and ask, is this going to be allowed? Don't proceed unless you're absolutely sure about that.
Brilliant. And then we've got two more questions, and then we will call it a day. So this one relates to the Research Challenge Award that you got from us. Could you list some of the important factors that made you get the Brainbox Challenge Award?
Important factors. So the Brainbox application it's free form. I don't know if it's still the same, Rory, but in 2018 it was free form.
Yeah.
Is it the same?
I think it is, yeah. Yeah, I might have to confirm it, but assume it is when you answer the question.
So you can put in whatever you want. So I think it was actually you had to stick within one side of A4. Which is very, very short. So you can choose to put in there whatever you want. So I laid out the science. I put in a diagram explaining the system that we were going to use. If you have ever the flexibility to add pictures, then do add pictures. A block of text that's just solid A4 text versus one that has white space and pictures and sections will always come across better. So yeah, I explained the system with, a diagram. I even I included a section on where this would fit into my career as well, which wasn't asked for, but I thought that would really help to let the people reading it see where I was at this point. And that was that I had just moved university and I didn't have access to the equipment that I would need. So it would be really beneficial to access this equipment. So I put it in career context as well. I spelled out a little bit of my previous CV, so I mentioned some recent publications and that sort of thing. So showing feasibility, because showing that I had already achieved some of these things, and also didn't overstep it. So the remit for that is to do a small pilot project. So I made sure that it was a small pilot project that would be achievable in a short period of time. So yeah, I hope that answers it.
Brilliant, thank you. And then this is the last question now. Thanks very much for your talk. Would you know what is the status regarding applications for bigger grants for someone who has a fixed term contract in Trinity?
No. I wonder what that means for someone who's a fixed term contract. So I wonder, is that person thinking that the grant would then be starting during their fixed term?
We may have to ask to clarify a bit in the Q&A, or alternatively, they can contact you directly from your email address listed here.
I'm not sure what they mean by that. Sorry.
Okay, that's okay. So Marie, she's gonna. Marie will contact you directly, and she's got your email address there.
Okay, thank you.
So that ties up the questions for now. I'd just like to thank you again for your time and all the thoughts and effort that you put into your presentation, which not only documents your experience, but also lets other people benefit from that. And it was incredibly kind of you to volunteer your time for that. And once again, we really appreciate it. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. And thanks everybody for attending.